Thanks, Michael. Now, I promise you something. I know that I'd like to conclude the formal proceedings for this evening and thank each of our speakers, but I know that you would think it was remiss of me and you'd be very disappointed if I didn't have the last word. That's it. Michael appreciated the speech, and the bus industry does appreciate the investment in the road infrastructure that we use every day and that we drive on, and it's an important part of our industry. I guess one of the arguments we put, which takes that to the next level, is that he who holds the gold makes the rules. You've got the money, you give it to the states and local government. We believe that it needs to be that money should be conditional on ensuring that those roads are integrated with the existing public transport network, that those roads, as part of that project the state's delivering, include bus priority and bus rapid transit initiatives where it's practical, and that the ties that are put on that funding to make sure that the states actually integrate that infrastructure into the existing network of public transport. And of course, don't forget, walking and cycling infrastructure that forms part of those roads is an important part, whether it's in the city and it's an urban road, or it's in a region and it's a new country road or town road that all of a sudden can include a bike path. But I think those conditions are an interesting aspect that the government could think more about without costing them an extra cent and imposing that requirement on states. So I think that's an area where we don't want to cost the government money, but we think there's some smart things you can do to actually encourage state and local governments to get more involved and think about what they're doing, or they don't get the money. Having said that, Australia is one of the few Western developed countries today where the national government does not have a direct role in public transport. Canada and the US, which are the closest to our federal governance arrangement, both have investment, dollars, infrastructure, programs, tax policies, environmental policies that are all focused on the state governments putting in place effective public transport systems and helping them get it right. So we're actually unique in that we're one of those few Western developed economies that aren't in the space at the moment. So having said that, the BIC will continue to seek direct involvement by the federal government in our cities and regions, how we move people, including public transport and bus services, and that's our mantra. We're not going away. We've been pretty solid for the last decade on what we say. Our message hasn't changed, and it's like a water drop on a stone. Sooner or later, we'll actually get there, I reckon. And Albo, we appreciate the help that the ALP is doing by recognising the importance of getting this stuff right in a policy sense, and Sam, that from the Greens' perspective, who have always been in that space. So it's appreciated, but we need to get a bipartisan approach at the end of the day. The 20-minute city concept is just another series of ideas that we're putting out there that actually we think are a part of the discussions for federal government and part of the solution. As an advocate for the federal government, for a federal government role in moving people, I often hear the statement that cities and public transport, mate, they're the responsibility of the states. APSI, it's the Constitution, stupid, we can't get involved. Well, recently I started thinking about this, and over Christmas I had a road trip, a little holiday with my wife. I learnt a couple of interesting things, because the road trip was from Bow Desert in southwest Queensland all the way back to Canberra down the middle, so through Warwick, down to Tenterfield, Gilgandra, Dubbo. And the lesson I learnt was that if you plan ahead and you actually stop every 3 hours or 4 hours and spend time overnight in these towns, and rather than try and do 8 hours in one day, you don't actually come up with the what I would call fairly common from my want to get to the destination of my wife threatening to jump out of the car at 100 kilometres an hour. So I learnt that actually stopping every 3 or 4 hours is quite a good tactic to actually keep the peace. But the other thing I found was that we're getting to Tenterfield, which is, I guess, the home of Federation, and the spiritual home of Federalism, where Henry Parkes gave his famous speech on the 6 colonies coming together and forming a nation, which really gave the whole debate its momentum that got us there. There was 3 things interesting I found in Tenterfield, because I knew all of this from my days at school and the history of federalism and federation and why we wanted to do it. And first, was interesting to find out that the local mythology is part of the discussions being had by the Federation Fathers as we move towards agreeing that Federation was a good idea, that the border of Queensland was going to actually be moved down to include Tenterfield. Tenterfield, second, was being considered as a possible future site of our national capital. And this was in order to appease Queensland, who was reluctant to join the Federation. And I'll come back to why Queensland had that position. And third, there's an interesting house in Tenterfield called Stanham House, and it's a grand manor. It sits at the top of the hill, looks over the whole town, and the local mythology was that as part of these negotiations to get Queensland to sign up to Federation, to move the border down to Tenterfield and give Queensland some more territory and to become the capital, that Stanham House was built to house the governor when it happened. And it actually all stacks up, and we don't know all the detail of the discussion that went on behind the scenes between Henry Parkes or Sir Samuel Griffiths in Queensland or whoever, the founding fathers that were discussing, or the premiers, but stacks up. A key conversation in federalism in the late 1800s was about the battle between protectionists and free traders. There was two teams, they were either opposed and for. The states who were protectionist, about protecting their local industry and their state's interests, and the free traders who thought by opening up the nation it was going to be for the benefit of everyone. So when you cast your mind back to the time of, I guess, convict and then colonial settlement, and then further forward to the time that the Federation was being formed and a constitution was being written, we are seriously looking at a different world that we now live in today. The Constitution was written and developed in a time that is vastly different from today. Queensland, for example, had its own navy. It had the Pacific Islands to draw slave labour from and form the wealth from its sugarcane. Queensland saw Federation as an end to slave labour and the profits they were making around the world by trading in sugar. With their navy, Queensland didn't see the need for a nationally organised defence or a federation to look after their interest. They had slave, they had sugarcane, they had money, and they had their own navy. Who needs it? So this is why I would argue that when you think about the argy-bargy that was going on between the states back then, the discussion about moving the border by New South Wales to bring the protectionists into line and providing them the capital city is a fair argument. And this is why Tenterfield was almost in Queensland and almost become Canberra. It didn't happen that way, but the negotiations would have been hard and fierce. And my point once again is they were different times. At the 1911 census, 10 years after Federation, 42% of the population was living in rural areas. By 2006, only 12% of Australians were located in rural areas. Today, 9 in 10 Australians live in urban areas, and around 75% of the total population live in our cities. Looking forward, between now and 2050, 3/4 of Australia's projected population growth is expected to occur in our state capitals. These are massive changes in our settlement and what's happened. When the founding fathers crafted the Constitution, they could not have imagined what our cities would look like today, let alone our major cities, regional centres, and the extent of urban sprawl. They could not have imagined that our capitals and major cities would have populations in the millions. They could not imagine how cars would change the travel patterns and the way that the cities were developed and settled. They could not have imagined that more than 80% of Australia's population would live in cities in 2015, and that agricultural production and trade in primary produce and mineral resources would not be the main driver of the economy today. Cities today are the knowledge drivers of the Australian economy. Agriculture and resources still play a significant part, and it's important, don't get me wrong. Regional Australia, and I'm a country boy, is important. But my father was the first in his family to move off the land, and that trend has continued for a long, long time. and the nature of our cities is proof of what's going on. The Australian Constitution and the nature of our federal model can no longer be the reason why the federal government can vacate the space of how we plan, build and move people in our cities and growing regions. The reality is that the dramatic changes in population growth, the dramatic change in relocation of our population to our cities and urban areas, the dramatic change in the Australian economy where 80% of the value of all goods and services produced in Australia is generated in our cities, and the dramatic impact of congestion and urban sprawl on our national prosperity since Federation can only mean one thing. It is an absolute necessity for the federal government to be involved in the future growth and the development of our cities and how we move people. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Dessert will be served shortly. That's the end of the night. Thanks for all coming.